Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Johan and this is Save the Popcorn. I'm the host of the Save the Popcorn podcast, available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and wherever you get your podcasts. But today on this channel, I'm going to be talking about a movie called Zodiac. Every once in a while, I enjoy getting recommended a blast from the past movie that I may not have watched when it first released, or I may not have even been born when the movie first released. This week I decided to watch Zodiac, a movie directed by David Fincher starring Robert Downey Jr., Jake Gyllenhaal, and Mark Ruffalo. I try to do this thing where I watch a movie and I try to figure out how many Marvel or DC superheroes and villains are in that same movie. I tried this a couple of years ago when I watched Spotlight, where I spotted Hulk, Howard Stark, Sabretooth, the Vulture, and Batman, and that one character from Doctor Strange that none of us quite remember. So nothing's different for this movie. There were quite a lot of Marvel superheroes slash villains in it. Jake Gyllenhaal, Robert Downey Jr. and Mark Ruffalo. But anyway, all that aside, I decided to watch this movie as I knew that David Fincher was a great director. He directed Gone Girl and Seven and Fight Club. So obviously I knew what I was getting into before I watched it. Judging from the name, I also knew that this movie was going to be about the Zodiac Killer. And I didn't know much about the Zodiac Killer prior to watching this movie. I know that it's an infamous case and no one ever knows conclusively who was the Zodiac Killer. And I think that my lack of knowledge about this case made the movie more enjoyable, as I had almost no information about the case beforehand. It's set in 1969, or at least it starts off from that year, which I feel like is a very weird time for American history, especially when it comes to serial killers, because Charles Manson was active around that time, the Zodiac Killer too. So I don't know what is going on between Hollywood and serial killers at that time, but I bet a lot of true crime podcasts even right now get most of their content from that era. I mean, there's so many unsolved mysteries and cases from that era alone. This movie is a classic whodunit where throughout the movie you're trying to find out who the Zodiac Killer is. The way the movie progresses from the first scene to the last is almost in the form of a case file. The movie progresses quickly and each scene is like a couple of notes from the case files themselves, you know. There are quick jump cuts to different venues, locations, and incidents that were definitely there in police reports. There are a lot of flash forwards. They skip like 8 years at a time. So when you're watching the movie, you really feel like as if you're reading the police reports in chronological order. You're watching the events as they took place in the case files. When it comes to the acting, Jake Gyllenhaal did a pretty good role as the straight man. Now, the straight man is a term usually used in sitcoms and comedies, you know, like if you take Arrested Development, for example, then the character Michael Bluth is a straight man, wherein he's the character with the straight face and he's taking all the information as the audience and he's getting all this information from all these different angles and he's responding to it. So Jake Gyllenhaal is the straight man in this movie and he's this cartoonist slash reporter who's trying to find out the truth behind the Zodiac Killer. He did a pretty good job in this role and it gave me Nightcrawler vibes, the way he performed in this movie, but less sinister. Robert Downey Jr. wasn't too active in this movie, especially towards the end of the movie. The beginning he was, you know, a prominent character and then later he kind of falls off after the midway point. It's interesting that Mark Ruffalo played a cop in this movie because if you look at Spotlight, in Spotlight Mark Ruffalo was the straight man. He was, you know, the person that the audience was rooting for to find out the truth. And here it's Jake Gyllenhaal, but Mark Ruffalo did a pretty good job as the cop. I feel like Mark Ruffalo is really good at being this opinionated and character-driven cop. He likes animal crackers a lot in this movie, and I feel like every time I see Mark Ruffalo in a movie, he always has one quirky trait about him. Okay, I'm going to go into slight spoilers, but then this case is like almost, 50 to 60 years old about the Zodiac Killer, so it's not really as much of a spoiler. But I was quite disappointed to find out that the real Zodiac Killer, if he was indeed Arthur Lee Allen, as is speculated by a lot of people, if he really was the Zodiac Killer, he died of a heart attack before, you know, the police could apprehend him. So that's kind of disappointing because it doesn't give anyone closure. It just makes everyone mad as to who was the real Zodiac Killer. It's kind of a dark comparison, but it reminds me of how Hitler shot himself in the head when he realized that the war was ending and he had been defeated. So I don't know, it was kind of anticlimactic. But then this is a real life story, so you can't change much. So I understand it's not the movie's fault for it being anticlimactic. The pacing of the movie is kind of a negative for me. As I mentioned before, they move from scene to scene like as if they're case files, and it kind of ruins the continuous flow of the movie for me. The scenes keep fading out and fading in, and it just doesn't have that continuity for me. The soundtrack too wasn't outstanding. Usually these true crime and thrilling sort of movies have a very distinct soundtrack. Just look at Fight Club or Gone Girl that have a very distinct soundtrack that immediately transport you into this world of the movie. But this movie didn't have an outstanding soundtrack, that it didn't stand out in any way for me. So anyway, that was Zodiac. I really enjoy making these short reviews on movies that I like watching. I do some shows too. If you want to be notified of more videos, then make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if you want to check out more content just like this, head on over to the link in bio where you can find my podcast, Save the Popcorn Podcast. I interview guests every week talking about their favorite movies and their favorite shows, and we analyze different movies and shows and franchises. So head on over to the link in bio and you can find those links all in the description. And I'll see you again for the next video.